Black Adam. We should talk.
These videos are not for children. If you're a children, then piss off.
Greetings and salutations, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, the Infuso. Got it memorized? Relatively recently, I've talked about how The Rock ruined Black Adam. And in that video, I discussed what went on behind the scenes. So now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's talk about the actual movie. For all the things I've said about someone who I've watched since I was a child, I do want to hand this man his roses. The Rock kinda goes outside his comfort zone with this one. He's not playing the typically goofy and charismatic character that he usually plays. He's playing a very serious stoic type that doesn't really understand much about the world around him, but also isn't actively trying to. This is a much more brutal and broody character than I'm used to seeing The Rock play. Black Adam does feel significantly different from his past performances, but to The Rock's credit, he was up for the challenge. He could have easily just shown up to the set as Dwayne Johnson in a Black Adam suit, and nobody would have corrected him. Being brought back to life following 5,000 years of rest, Black Adam is the proverbial fish out of water, completely oblivious to everything. He's like a sponge, but he's absorbing his surroundings selectively. Because of the character's unfamiliarity with the world around him, he's really just trying to adapt to whatever he hears and sees. Moments after watching a Western on TV, he's having a Mexican standoff in real life. When the kid that he's been bonding with, Amon, tells him to start using a catchphrase, he uses the very one that he suggests, though he does so in the wrong context.
Tell them the Men in Black
sent you.
Several times. He tries and fails to understand the concept of humor, and writes off any moments of him being disingenuous as him being sarcastic, as he hasn't quite got the grasp on that yet either. I would say that his characterization of Black Adam feels like what would happen if you merged Arnie from T2 and Drax from the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie. This is different for The Rock, and I will say I think that he does a fine job at it. He somehow manages to make this monotone brute feel fun, essentially playing a seemingly emotionless, violent stoic, and yet The Rock manages to make the character come across as human. Even when tasked with not emoting as much, The Rock's charisma shines through his character's stoic nature. The casual and careless way he disposes of those he comes across is so second nature to him that it's comical. He stays stone-faced every time he's on screen, and yet he still sort of makes you want to root for him, even in the moments you know you probably shouldn't be. Surprisingly, I really like The Rock in the role, and I like that The Rock chose a role that challenged him and allowed him to do something different from what he's normally used to. Here, Dwayne can't rely on his people-pleasing persona. If anything, he's sort of doing the polar opposite, and he's excelling at it. When I see him in the sometimes caped costume, I don't ever feel like I'm looking at Hollywood megastar Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. I feel like I'm looking at a larger-than-life, superpowered protagonist / problem. Without question, is Dwayne's performance the best part of this movie. I mentioned before that the character is traditionally a villain, and only recently has started to take on more of a vigilante-like persona. This movie does a good job at highlighting both sides of the character, initially showing him as a violent, immovable object, a powerful, unstoppable force that didn't hesitate in using his force or powers. In spite of his malevolent mentality and antagonistic actions, his reputation is that of a hero. In some places, the character is worshipped as a god, or a champion of the people. There's an entire false belief system centered around his alleged heroic deeds. It's because of this reputation and how he's seen in the eyes of others that actually sort of inspires Black Adam to become more of a hero. It's almost as if he decides he wants to live up to the false legacy that surrounds his name. That's a pretty powerful story, and not one that's told very often. It's only a shame that this is a plot point like everything else that gets glossed over. But the praise for this persona is based on false notions. The people of Kahndaq believe in the heroic deeds of the champion, not realizing that Teth Adam is not the true champion. He was the one saved by the real champion, and gifted his abilities. The plot twist and end reveal that Black Adam is not the true champion of Kahndaq, but rather the father of that fallen champion was an inspired choice. It's actually a little bit different from how it goes down in the comics. In actuality, Black Adam was not the father, but the uncle of the true champion. And that champion didn't die protecting his family, he died at the hands of them. Black Adam actually killed his nephew to steal his powers. So I think this change was fitting of the story, as clearly this telling of the tale is trying to redeem the character and turn him into the same hero as Shazam. And for what they're trying to do, I think that this change works really well. It also really adds to the tragedy that this Black Adam is seeing, and it lends credence to his turn to the light side. Not only is he incentivized to become a hero in his own right by those who believed in him, but also to not dishonor his son who selflessly sacrificed himself to defend his father. There's a heartbreaking history with this character of oppressive origins, and I think that makes for a really compelling backstory. I actually really like the route they went with this character. It would have been really easy to bring this villain into full hero territory, but they chose to stick to the course of the anti-hero, even at the end deciding to take the life of his enemy rather than imprison him. The fact that the character lives in areas shaded gray, even by the end of the movie, quite frankly, was relieving. I like that he didn't see the entire error of his ways, because while this is a flaw of the character from a hero standpoint, it's also a function of the character overall. Through his interactions with the rest of the cast, the character learns. And not just learns, but also further evolves. Only through the relationships he makes is he bettered as both a person and a hero. While these dynamics are integral to Adam's development, in execution they're unfortunately rushed. The movie is really missing important beats. It jumps from plot point to plot point and makes very little stops in between. The movie could have benefited from a few character cuts and more time divvied up between the core characters and their relationships. The biggest problem with this movie is a problem I have with a lot of DC films, and that's its pace. It's so focused on getting to the final destination that the audience doesn't really get to fully enjoy the journey there. It would have been nice to see more human moments in this movie. Moments with the characters bonding, learning where they compare, where they contrast, and just beginning to enjoy each other's company through the circumstances that they're stuck in. There was very little of that. And in the end, I think that hurts the product. It doesn't make their relationships feel real, it feels like they're insisted upon. They're conjured up by the writers. Sometimes the characters feel more like props for The Rock. Each one of them blatantly put in place to soullessly serve the script. Amon is of course meant to be Teth Adam's surrogate son. A young man with a pure heart who believes in Black Adam, and in a lot of ways, allows Black Adam to believe in himself. Adriana is our strong, smart female lead, whose courage defines her. But literally that's it. And her brother is there to land punchlines while The Rock lands punches. The really big problem is that when you step outside of the Black Adam character, you realize there isn't a whole lot to talk about. This was very clearly a Rock vehicle. Outside of Black Adam, the movie has some major character problems, because most of the movie's characters feel like very vague representations of characters from the comics. They're silhouettes. You can tell that they're people, but you can't actually see any of their defining traits. The characters are tragically underwritten and underutilized, and ultimately they just feel like their only place in the movie is to interact with The Rock. And being that he's the main character, I guess fair enough, but it would have been nice if you wrote people to feel like people. Or, just wrote people. You'd think that they'd be written to be people as opposed to plot points. They're really just cogs in the Black Adam machine. They're mostly nondescript and unmemorable. That's not a jab at the actors, they're all putting on passable performances to say the least. It's the overall presentation of this film. The other characters are severely underwhelming and underdeveloped. But they're not bad by any means. Their acting is believable, and I buy them as the characters that they're playing. The problem is we never get to learn more about those characters. We have just about the same exact understanding of who they are in the final scene as we do in the first scene. The real story here is the anti-hero's journey, from bad to good. Ish. Inspired by the people that believed in him. That's the meat of this story. Those are the parts I love watching. But everything else is really just fancy window dressing. The heroes in training, the villain, all of that just feels like unnecessary add-ons. I feel like the movie could have done without all of this, and it probably would have been made that much better without those additions. Even the villain in this movie is a total letdown. One of the absolute weakest throwaway filler bad guys of the month that the DCU has ever offered up. I think a big part of the problem here is that he truly isn't the main antagonist. This hero flick is a little different in general, being that it doesn't actually follow a hero. Sabak isn't a main antagonist, he's a temporary obstacle. A plot point who was put in place to further the plot, but nothing more. His motivations are shallow and paper thin, and there's absolutely no depth to his character. I could stand in a puddle of him and not get my socks wet. Even the way he looks is so bland and boring. It is the most basic bad guy design I think I've ever seen. Actually, as a matter of fact, the character was much more interesting before his demonization. Ishmael was a greedy, selfish master manipulator who orchestrated heists of ancient artifacts while also acting as an inside man amongst his enemies. That is so much more interesting than evil demon devil thing. On top of that, the actor was putting in a good performance, but all of that is completely diminished when the special effects take effect. You have a CGI model replacing his actual physical performance, and you have this excess of voice effects drowning out his actual voice and inflection. You could have literally put any person in this role at this point. Sabak is such a throwaway villain. There is nothing special or interesting about him. I'm sorry, but I come from a long line of evil people, so it's my destiny to be the most evil just isn't captivating. The new junior heroes who aren't actually juniors are infuriating. They don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to be in this movie outside of world building. They're all underwritten. The little we do see of them is still somehow too much, and they just tonally conflict with everything around them. The movie goes from feeling like it takes place in the Snyderverse to suddenly feeling like it should be airing on the Disney Channel. The chemistry between the two that the movie seems to be insisting upon is non-existent. I don't buy their flirtations whatsoever. Whole movie could have, and probably should have, been made without them. Even by time the credits roll, I'm not entirely sure what these two were ever really doing there. I guess they had small parts to play in fight scenes, but I don't think that's a good enough reason to have them play supporting characters. There were plenty of other ways of writing out those scenarios. Or, if you felt that you needed to include these characters, you could always go the X-Men route and have them show up for a scene before making their exit. It worked the first time they did that. I don't know, I think it's weird to have so much screen time dedicated to characters who don't make all that much of an impression on a viewing audience or an impact in the plot that they're part of. I'm only just now realizing I've never addressed either one of them by their name, and if I didn't catch that error here, I probably would have went the whole review without calling them Cyclone and Atom Smasher, which is kind of telling. They are so devoid of merit and purpose that their names weren't even worth bringing up to me. While I think Adriana and Aman are both well acted, they're underutilized to the point that by time it's all said and done, they haven't had nearly enough time to blossom as characters. Mo Amer as Kareem, however, is constantly hilarious and a consistent source of entertainment in this movie. While he may seem a little hammy and over the top, it is perfectly welcome here, as his reactionary nature feels incredibly warranted given the events of the movie. I really wish I had more to say about him because I really do want to sing this man's praises, but similarly to everyone else, he isn't given his due. The time we spend with this character is a lot of fun, and he is memorable. It's nice to see him get a new lease on life at the end upon learning he dies by electricity. It kind of encourages him to be more courageous when he's not dealing with man-made lightning. But like the other characters, his involvement in all of this is limited. Unlike all the other characters, his character stands out and is extremely entertaining. Outside of The Rock, the only two other characters that really shine in this movie, without question, has to be the founding fathers of the Justice Society, Dr. Fate and Hawkman. Their relationship is probably the strongest out of any in this movie, not just because both of these performances are very well acted, because the two men in their roles seem to share a lot of chemistry. There's not only a friendship, but also somewhat of a brotherhood established, after the two have spent years and years working alongside each other. They have each other's back even when the other doesn't seem to have their own best interest in mind. Not only do they struggle to save others, when it comes down to it, Dr. Fate sacrifices himself in order to save his friend. A history between the two is evident based on the way they carry themselves in each other's presence. They don't need to reminisce about past events throughout the runtime. Their concern for each other's well-being is all the evidence of their friendship needed. As I've previously explained, the movie doesn't do a terrific job in explaining itself, but I do think it did a phenomenal job in telling us about these two. Without actually telling us about these two. They don't have a lot of time in this, and yet by the end of it, I feel like I've watched the tragic end of a career-long friendship. They aren't just great combined, they work as separate solid components to the movie as well. They're both solid iterations of characters I'd never thought I'd see on the big screen. Honestly, these are two of the slightly more obscure DC characters that I happen to love. but I also don't expect anyone else to. Dr. Fate is every bit as elegant and omnipresent as you'd hope. He is a constant source of wisdom and dry humor, offering up words of comfort in times of need, which I imagine is probably easier for a man who can see every possible outcome. I think my biggest fear with this character being translated over to the big screen is that if it's done wrong, he'd probably come off as a discount Doctor Strange. But I'm happy to say, that's not the case here. Pierce Brosnan was an inspired choice, and given minimal time, he was utilized to the maximum effect. He carries himself in times of chaos in such a calm and casual manner, never once showing any sort of cockiness, but instead the utmost confidence in his actions. Again, given that he sees all, there really is no fear to have of the unknown, as there isn't one. And when he finally does meet the unknown, he willingly meets it head-on to save those close to him. Dr. Fate accepting his own fate is honestly one of the most beautiful death scenes in all of the DCEU. Is he severely underpowered and killed off with ease? Yes, Dr. Fate from the comics would probably not go out this easy. However, I'm willing to look past that for the simple fact that A, this was a very well put together scene, and also his death was an intentional sacrifice as a means of saving Hawkman. So I can somewhat accept this. This may not meet the character that I'm familiar with in terms of power, but in terms of depiction, it feels quite on brand. Hawkman is a strong, fierce, fearless leader. He doesn't fear death. As a matter of fact, should his death ensure the lives of others, he welcomes it. This Hawkman is a warrior through and through, holding his morals over everything else. He's a tired veteran of the crime-fighting gig, trying to teach the next generation of heroes, though he doesn't have the patience of a saint. I like the Hawkman-Black Adam dynamic. Hawkman is there to challenge Adam's views and methods, to explain that while his intentions are noble, his actions are not, and he's also there to threaten and tease a showdown between the two. They continually clash. The only time ever meeting eye to eye is when the safety of others is on the line, as it seems saving civilians takes priority over their conflicting moral compasses. There seems to be a certain level of silent respect between the two. Hawkman knows that Adam to some extent means well, but he's not going to dismiss his wrongdoings just because of the good that they lead to. It's a really interesting dynamic that I think could only get better with time had it been afforded room to grow. There are some things about this movie that feel a little bit too goofy for the serious story that they're trying to tell. I feel like a lot of lapses in logic and jumping to conclusions and just overall bad choices are made. At the very beginning, we're shown servants fighting, but this kid breaks them up by walking up to them and just telling them to stop. Yeah, these were desperate times, and these are desperate men. I would much sooner believe that they'd kill each other for a potential reward, rather than listening to a scrawny kid giving a work-together speech. This woman has a gun to her head, but this guy gives her enough time to read incantation allowed to summon the rock. Like that was a prolonged period of time. You should have caught on by at least the start of line 2. Having Dr. Fate and Hawkman, two heroes with at least a decade or so of experience in their field, approach Teth Adam with threats instead of attempting to calmly reason with him was a really strange decision. Telling a former slave who spent his life being powerless, who has now been granted the powers of a god, to kneel before you, just seems like an all-around bad idea. Like, it's in poor taste generally, but it's also not a great way of getting someone to hear your side of the argument out. And while I'm at it, the existence of a Justice Society confuses me. We've just seen the Justice League put together in this universe, and costumed heroes are being treated as if they're a brand new thing. Yet you're telling me there was an already established Justice Society? And there also is still currently a Justice Society? Alright, weird. Where were they during the events of every single film? But this movie's greatest problem is its inability to take its time to tell a story. They had all the right elements there, they did not give this the time that it needed. The plot is rushed, and the movie spends its runtime just bouncing from plot point to plot point in breakneck speed, trying to get to the finish line. The issue here is that because of this, we don't really get to know any of the characters very intimately, even the ones in our main cast. There are some characters who feel like they have had no reason to be included whatsoever. They don't do much, they don't serve much of a purpose to the plot, and ultimately all they do is eat up its screen time. You could forgive a character for not having a lot to do, when they're characters that we get to know and find entertaining. But you don't get that here. In Black Adam, there's a bunch of characters that are just sort of there. Sometimes this movie feels more like a bottle episode of a TV show, because everything is so incredibly condensed. So much so that by the end of it, it feels like they only travel to 4 locations, continually. And the special effects aren't always great. They aren't always terrible, but a lot of the time they are. If I'm being honest, I think this movie could have really benefited from having a tie-in to Shazam. I mean, sure, they recycled the same wizard, so there's kind of that vague existence and connection between the two, but it's really not enough. As a matter of fact, I find the lack of Shazam in this story highly disturbing. You really shouldn't have one without the other. It just doesn't work as well. Case in point, the final product. I'm sorry, both final products. Is Black Adam as bad as people say it is? No, absolutely not. But it's also not nearly as good as Warner Brothers were hoping it would be. They were looking for something groundbreaking to redefine the DCU and bring in a wider audience. But this was just a pretty standard average superhero movie. It's not great by any means, but I also don't think it's terrible. At the very least, it's passable. A flawed piece of work that I probably wouldn't ever go out of my way to see again, but one that I don't mind having seen twice. There are parts of it that I loved, and plenty more that I hated. But I think there's a genuinely good movie there. They just didn't take enough time to fully etch it out. Ultimately, I think this was a good starting point. I think the character and his mythos probably would have benefited from a sequel, and I think it's truly unfortunate it will never get one. Black Adam is nowhere near as bad as they say, but it's also not as close to as good as it should have been. In my opinion, it's not a bad movie. It's just a severely underwritten and yet still somehow overinflated one. Ultimately, it's a pretty okay movie that had the potential to be so much more. I will always enjoy this movie for what it is, but I find it incredibly hard not to watch this and wonder what could have been. Now, is it comic book accurate? No, absolutely not. But you know what? I don't think that's a cardinal sin when there isn't that much of a fandom here. I think that when characters are more obscure, it's kind of a creative license to do whatever you'd like. Just look at what James Gunn did with Guardians of the Galaxy. Those characters were relative unknowns, and then they were adapted to the big screen as blank slates. Those characters aren't like the ones from the comics. And this Black Adam isn't the one from the comics either. They're really going the Tim Burton route in response to pre-established lore and source material, in that it takes concepts and elements from the original stories, but really just does whatever it wants with them. If I'm judging this as a faithful adaptation, it's a pass. As in, I would pass on watching it. But then again, I don't know how many people were really clamoring for a movie following the second biggest villain to some C-list superhero. Sorry. If I'm judging it on its own merit, I would say that it's actually pretty good. I talked about how The Rock ruined Black Adam, and I stand by every one of my words. But what I probably didn't emphasize is that this movie would have never gotten made if it wasn't for the passion of The Rock. DC didn't make this movie for Shazam fans. All 6 of them that are out there. Hell, DC didn't even make this movie for superhero fans. They made this movie for The Rock. They made it in the hopes of appeasing the Great One and having him become a fixture in their cinematic universe. Without The Rock attached, this movie would have never even been made. Actually, I don't think it would ever have been conjured up. And Shazam 2 would look really, really different. My point is that Black Adam as a project lived and died at the hand of The Rock. He's both what led to this movie being made, and also what led to a lot of this movie's failure. Whether you love or hate the product, The Rock is the one that you can thank or blame, or in my case, both. I genuinely enjoy Black Adam, but I can also understand why not everyone else did. There's something special there, but it feels like it's in its most early stage. It's drawn beautifully, but audiences were hoping for an intricate painting, and instead they were met with a simple sketch. Black Adam truly feels as if the movie was made using the first draft of a script. There's a blueprint there, but there's no foundation built upon it. It's like a puzzle. You know, they have all the right pieces, but nobody ever bothered to line them up properly. I have a soft spot in my heart for this movie. To me, I think the good trumps the bad, but it doesn't always trump the basic. With all that being said, If you like this video and want to see a retrospective of the entire DCEU/Snyderverse, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"A rock that is no rock."
I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.